Hey there, sleepyheads. Welcome back to the channel. Before we drift into the classic journey of Beth Smith from Rick and Morty, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. It's always magical seeing how far and wide this sleepy little community reaches. All right, lights low, blankets up, let's begin. It starts in silence. Before the chaos, before the portals and paradoxes, there was a little girl who just wanted her dad to stay. Beth Smith's childhood wasn't filled with magical memories or bedtime stories. It was quieter than that, colder. She grew up in a home where one name loomed large even when he wasn't there. Rick Sanchez, her father, the scientist, the adventurer, the genius, and the man who disappeared. Beth was young when he left, too young to fully understand why. She would come home from school with drawings, science projects, scraped knees, or bruised feelings, and he wouldn't be there. Her mother would offer explanations that sounded more like excuses. He's working on something important, or Rick needs space. But even as a child, Beth could feel the emptiness he left behind, a quiet ache that settled in the corners of the house. And so she filled that silence with ambition. She read books far above her grade level, learned how to take things apart and put them back together, sometimes better than before. Her teachers were impressed, sometimes even concerned at how driven she was. She was precise, focused, and fiercely independent, traits that mirrored someone she barely remembered, but had never stopped chasing. Because in her heart, Beth thought that maybe if she became exceptional, he would come back. Rick wasn't just gone, he was a legend. Stories of his brilliance swirled in the background of Beth's life. Everyone seemed to know who he was. Her classmates whispered about the mad scientist who disappeared from Earth. Her teachers gave her strange looks when they realized who her father was. To them, Rick was a name from underground science journals and government red flag lists. But to Beth, Rick was the missing puzzle piece. She kept photos of him in an old drawer, wore his old lab coat once as a child, and refused to take it off for an entire week. She even talked to his memory sometimes, asking questions out loud in her bedroom when no one else could hear. Would you be proud of this, Dad? Would you like my prototype? Would you come home if I solved this formula? She didn't know then that genius and abandonment often come in the same breath. As she grew older, her talent became both her armor and her prison. People expected her to be cold, logical, maybe even dangerous. Some admired her, others avoided her. But no one really saw her. Not the girl underneath all the sharpness. The girl who still wondered if she was enough for someone like Rick. And so Beth did what she thought would prove it once and for all. She pursued medicine. Not just any field, but equine surgery. A bizarre and demanding specialization, as precise as it was isolating. It combined science, control, and an odd flair that felt fitting. After all, how many equine surgeons were there in her age group, in her city, maybe even the country? In her mind, Rick would have found that impressive, maybe even worthy of respect. But behind all the achievements, Beth's heart carried a silent weight, a loneliness shaped by childhood promises never fulfilled. She got used to the ache. She wore it well, like a necklace she never took off. To others, she seemed strong, confident, in control. But deep down, she was still that little girl staring out the window, waiting for the sound of portal energy and footsteps down the hallway, waiting for a father who never came home. When Rick finally returned, everything changed. But before that, before the show's wild timelines and interdimensional chaos, there was Beth Smith. Just Beth. A child shaped by absence, molded in the shadow of genius and raised by questions that never got answers. And sometimes, those questions echoed louder at night. Beth's childhood wasn't entirely empty. There were good days. Days when her mother was patient, when the sun came through the kitchen window just right, when a horse figurine made her smile. But even those moments were colored by the absence of Rick, not just the man, but what he represented. Because Rick wasn't just a father to her. He was an idea, a mystery she could never solve, a force that shaped her without ever being present. And so she became obsessive about control, about being right, about choosing paths that were difficult enough to earn respect, yet distant enough to avoid dependence. Friends? She had a few, but never too close. Relationships? Brief, with a wall between her and whoever tried to get in. She loved in her own way, but love meant vulnerability, and Beth had learned early that vulnerability came with the consequences. By her teens, she had taken full control of her life. School was just another obstacle. Expectations didn't scare her, they fed her. When she entered veterinary school, professors noticed how she rarely second-guessed herself. She was precise, almost mechanical. Even her classmates said she had the sharpness of a scalpel. And somewhere deep inside, a voice would whisper, "You're almost there, just be a little better. He'll notice this." But Rick didn't notice. Not yet. Because Rick was still gone, off in the stars, leaving Beth to become a version of herself he might have approved of or ignored all the same. Her mother tried to fill the gap in small, imperfect ways. Dinners that were often quiet. Advice that came out too blunt or too late. Beth sometimes resented her, sometimes pitied her. She didn't understand why her mother had allowed Rick to leave without a fight. She didn't understand why love wasn't enough to keep someone like him grounded. Still, Beth buried her questions. She buried a lot of things. Her fear of not being good enough. Her craving for acknowledgement. The dreams she never spoke of out loud, building tech, exploring planets, maybe even being Rick's partner in genius. Instead, she told herself that being a surgeon was enough, that being smarter than the people around her would eventually make the ache go away. But that ache had roots, and those roots reached deep into her adulthood. When Beth met Jerry, it wasn't because he was everything she ever wanted. It was because he was safe, kind, predictable, and most importantly, he stayed. Jerry was simple. He needed her, admired her, and built his world around her approval. That approval gave Beth a strange sense of power, a way to rewrite the pain of being left. If Rick was the man who walked away, Jerry was the man who never would. At least not then. Still, she never let herself fall all the way into happiness. Not truly. Not deeply. Because to Beth, happiness felt unstable. Like a bubble that would burst the moment she let herself believe in it. And then, Rick returned. Not with a warm embrace or an apology, but with chaos, inventions, and the same maddening brilliance that had haunted her for decades. And in that moment, something inside Beth shifted. She didn't just welcome him back. She absorbed him. As if all those years of silence and pain had only been waiting for this moment. The return of her father, the source of her longing, the mirror she had spent her entire life polishing, finally standing in front of her. But what she saw wasn't quite what she remembered. Rick was older, colder, still brilliant, still reckless, but now damaged in ways she hadn't imagined. And suddenly all the questions she had asked as a child were replaced by more difficult ones. Why did he really come back? What did he see in her now? Was she still just a shadow to him, or something more? Beth wouldn't ask those questions out loud. Not yet. Instead, she smiled. She said, "Welcome." She made room for him at the table. And somewhere inside, a quiet part of her braced for the storm. Because when you live in the shadow of genius long enough, You forget what the sun feels like. Rick's return didn't feel like a reunion. It felt like a reawakening. Not just for Beth, but for something inside her she had carefully kept buried, the piece that longed for adventure, for risk, for validation that didn't come from grades or surgical success. She had worked so hard to build a stable life, a safe home, a normal family. And now, the person who had once shattered her childhood was setting off fireworks in her living room. At first, she tried to play it cool. A few sharp remarks here and there, some dry humor, that guarded distance she always used to keep people from getting too close. But Rick didn't care for those walls. He blew past them like they were paper. And Beth let him. Because no matter how hard she had worked to become her own person, she still wanted him to see her. Not just as a daughter or a caretaker, or the girl he left behind, but as an equal. She remembered the first time Rick actually praised something she did. It was offhanded, tossed out in the middle of a chaotic experiment. Something like, nice calibration. It was barely a sentence, but it echoed in Beth's chest for hours afterward, days even. All the awards, degrees, and surgeries. None of them had hit as hard as that one throwaway comment. She wouldn't admit it, not even to herself, but Rick's approval lit a fire in her, a dangerous one. It made her reckless, more willing to push boundaries she had once carefully respected. She started seeing life through Rick's eyes as a puzzle to outsmart, a structure to rebel against, a world too dumb to deserve sincerity. But Beth was never quite like Rick. She had learned to hold in her emotions, not to escape them. She didn't drink to forget she remembered everything. And somewhere behind her eyes, the little girl still watched everything unfold, still wondering if she had finally become what he wanted, or just a reflection of his own regret. As time passed, their interactions grew more layered. Rick started including her in things tech designs, philosophical arguments, cosmic debates. It wasn't warm or fatherly, but it was something. To Beth, it felt like being chosen. She began to defend him more openly, even when he made mistakes. She excused his absence in front of Summer and Morty, trying to smooth the cracks that were beginning to show in her family. It was like watching an old building crumble while telling everyone, "It's just settling, everything's fine." But everything wasn't fine. The more Beth leaned into Rick's world, the more distant she became from her own. Jerry noticed. Summer noticed. Even Morty, wrapped up in his own universe of trauma, could see it. Beth wasn't just Rick's daughter anymore. She was starting to become Rick. And in quiet moments, when the portal gun was silent and the house was asleep, Beth would sit in the dark, fingers wrapped around a cold cup of tea, and wonder, was this who she always was? Or had she simply molded herself into the person she thought he would love? 'Cause Rick never asked her to change. He never begged for her attention or approval or time. He just showed up like a storm rolling back through town and expected her to deal with it. And she did. Because love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet sacrifice. Sometimes it's swallowing your own needs to keep someone else from disappearing again. But Beth was tired. Tired of chasing shadows. Tired of living in echoes. She had everything: a family, a profession, a home, but none of it felt like it was hers. It felt borrowed, staged, like a life built just in case Rick ever cared enough to notice. And still she waited. Still hoping that someday, in some small way, he'd look at her and say, "I'm proud of you." But that day hadn't come. And Beth, for all her strength and smarts, was still waiting by the window. There were days Beth could almost convince herself that everything was okay. Dinner would be calm, Rick would be tinkering quietly in the garage, and Morty would be rambling about his latest trauma like it was just another Tuesday. Summer might be half listening with one earbud in, and Jerry would be trying in his own fumbling way to make someone laugh. And Beth, standing at the sink or sitting at the head of the table, would feel something close to peace. Not joy exactly. That had always felt foreign to her, but a kind of stillness. Like maybe, for a brief moment, her family wasn't falling apart. Maybe they were all just surviving the best way they could. But even in those quiet hours, the tension lived just beneath her skin. Like a pulse. Like a string pulled too tight. Because for Beth, stillness often felt like the moment before something broke. Rick had taught her that not through words, but through presence. His reappearance in her life brought more than interdimensional chaos. It brought a subtle erosion, a feeling that no matter how hard she worked, how much she gave, it would never be enough to keep things steady. There was always a bigger truth looming. Rick would never fully stay. He was brilliant, yes, capable of creation beyond comprehension. But his love came in flickers, not flames, in offhand praise, not consistent presence. And Beth had learned to survive on scraps. Scraps of attention. Scraps of acknowledgement. Scraps of a relationship she had spent her whole life building from one-sided memories. Sometimes she'd visit the garage when he wasn't there, or just to look around. To breathe in the quiet hum of machines and tools, hoping some part of him had left a mark she could understand. A schematic, maybe, a drawing, a sign that he thought of her even when she wasn't looking. But Rick didn't leave signs. He left damage. And Beth, smart, capable, and chronically self-sufficient, had become an expert in cleaning up what he broke. She did it in her marriage. She did it as a mother. She did it inside herself. Every flaw in her life she examined like a surgeon, precisely, rationally, without feeling. That was her gift, the ability to distance herself from pain long enough to operate on it, to stitch it up, to make it functional again. Some wounds don't heal just because you understand them. Some pain doesn't soften just because you can name its cause. Sometimes the very brilliance you inherit is what breaks you the most. And Beth was brilliant. But she was also tired. Tired of performing. Tired of trying to fill the space Rick left with titles and degrees and careful control. Tired of being told she was just like him when all she had ever wanted was to be seen apart from him. She didn't hate him. She couldn't. There was too much love woven to the pain, too much memory, too much yearning, too many sleepless nights spent wondering what she did wrong. But love in Beth's world didn't mean safety. It meant compromise. It meant pretending not to notice when someone you cared about looked through you like glass. And yet, she stayed. Because that's what Beth did. She stayed. For her kids. For her husband. For the family she built from pieces of chaos and threads of hope. Even when she didn't believe in it, she held it together. Even when Rick pulled the universe apart, she pulled the dinner table back together. And maybe that was her quiet genius. Not the science, not the surgery, but the ability to carry generations of damage and still show up. Still try. Still hope in her own silent way that something better was possible. Even in the shadow of someone else's genius. Beth Smith was building a story of her own. And in the quiet of night, when the stars outside Rick's portal gun stopped swirling, Beth remained, holding everything, just a little bit longer. There's a saying Beth had heard once, "We all become our parents eventually." She used to scoff at that. Back when she was younger, more idealistic, and convinced she'd carved her own path. After all, how could she become someone who was never around? How could you turn into a ghost? But life has a strange way of circling back. And Rick had never truly left her. Even when he vanished from her childhood, his presence lingered in the architecture of her mind and the way she thought, the way she spoke, the way she didn't quite fit in. She had Rick's intelligence, his sarcasm, his contempt for mediocrity. But more than that, she carried his wounds she hadn't earned but inherited. And when Rick returned, it was like watching a reflection step through the front door. Beth hadn't expected that. She expected to feel anger, resentment, even closure. Instead, she felt familiarity, a quiet recognition. Because the truth is, Beth didn't just miss Rick. She understood him. And that made everything more complicated. The two of them shared a rhythm, one the rest of the family couldn't quite follow. Conversations that spun into theories and philosophies. Dark humor that bounced between them like a secret code. It wasn't love in the traditional sense, but it was connection. And for Beth, connection was something she didn't allow herself to need often. But Rick pulled it out of her, effortlessly. Sometimes with a sly grin, other times with a casual insult that somehow still felt like attention. He challenged her, mocked her, pushed her boundaries, and she let him. Because beneath the tension was something undeniable, Beth saw herself in Rick. And in moments she wouldn't admit out loud, she liked it. She liked that he respected her intelligence. She liked that she didn't have to dumb herself down to be heard. She liked that for once, someone didn't just expect her to be a mother or a wife, but something more. And yet that likeness came with a cost. The more she mirrored Rick, the more she drifted from the people around her. Jerry felt at first the way Beth's sharpness cut deeper, the way she rolled her eyes at his gentleness. Summer, too, began to flinch at Beth's casual detachment. Morty barely noticed he was already slipping into his own chaos, but even he could feel when Beth's gaze became distant, like she was looking through them, not at them. Beth was slipping, not away from her family, but toward something else, toward Rick, toward the void he carried with him like a badge. They started spending more time together, fixing things in the garage, debating existential dilemmas over cold coffee, even going on a few small adventures. Rick would offer her gadgets. She would offer insight. They fit. But fitting isn't the same as healing. Beth began to adopt his behaviors, his cynicism, his superiority, his quiet contempt for anything sentimental or ordinary. She stopped saying, "I love you," as often. She rolled her eyes more, dismissed feelings as distractions. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't cruel. It was reflex. Learned behavior from a man who had survived so long by caring less, by thinking faster, by staying above it all. And Beth, for all her independence, had always wanted to be seen as worthy of that world. Still, the mirror between them wasn't perfect. Rick was untethered, reckless. He had burned too many bridges to count. Beth, on the other hand, still had roots. Children who looked up to her. A husband who, despite everything, still loved her. A home that needed someone to keep it from falling apart. And so Beth lived in two realities. One where she was Rick's equal sharp, detached, clever. And another where she was Beth fragile, flawed, aching to be enough for everyone. Most nights she didn't sleep easily. Her mind would spiral into silent arguments with herself, with Rick, with the parts of her that didn't know which life she wanted more. Because the closer she got to Rick, the more she risked losing herself. But maybe, just maybe, that self was never whole to begin with. There were moments, fleeting, soft, and almost painful in their quietness, when Beth would catch herself doing something exactly the way Rick did. Not just the way she held a tool or furrowed her brow over a schematic, but deeper things. The way she walked out of a room without explanation when emotions got too thick. The way she silenced people with a glance because words suddenly felt unnecessary. The way she cut her own feelings off at the root before they had the chance to bloom into vulnerability. It frightened her sometimes, how natural it felt. Jerry would ask her a question, maybe something small, like how her day had gone, and instead of answering, Beth would stare at him blankly, her mind already elsewhere. In another world, in another thought. She could feel herself drifting and didn't know how to stop. Summer would come to her with frustration about school or friends or just being a teenage girl in a bizarre universe. And Beth would respond with cold logic instead of comfort. A solution, not a shoulder. A fix, not a feeling. And Morty, well, Morty never asked for anything. He had learned early on that Beth wasn't the kind of mom who coddled. She was the mom who patched wounds without flinching and told you to get back in the fight. It wasn't that she didn't care. She cared too much. So much that it hurt to feel it all, so she learned not to show it. She thought that was strength. She thought that was control. But now, watching herself through Rick's shadow, she wasn't so sure. Because Rick didn't just shield himself, he exiled himself. From love, from warmth, from the things that made existence a little softer. And Beth? Beth was starting to see that same exile forming around her. At first she denied it. She told herself she was just tired. Her life was chaotic. The kids were exhausting, and marriages were messy, and fathers who built weapons in their garages at 3 a.m. were just part of the scenery now. But deep down, something hollowed out beneath her ribcage. A feeling that she was performing her life instead of living it. Rick didn't talk about these things. He never would. But Beth could feel them between their silences. The way he lingered a little longer when she was quiet. The way he sometimes looked at her with something between recognition and regret. They never said it, but they both knew. They were each other's most complicated mirror. Rick saw in Beth the person he might have become if he'd stayed. And Beth saw in Rick the person she might become if she wasn't careful. Still, she didn't pull away. Not entirely. Because for all the damage, for all the coldness and chaos, Rick still offered something no one else could. He saw her brilliance. He respected it. In a world where she was often reduced to roles, mom, wife, fixer, caretaker, Rick treated her like a mine, like a peer, like someone worth listening to. And that was intoxicating. But the line between admiration and emulation is razor thin. Beth began to notice how she handled failure differently now. Less self-reflection, more deflection. Less compassion for herself, more frustration. She started pushing people away before they could disappoint her. Started seeing connection as a distraction. These weren't conscious choices. They were habits, formed from the quiet absorption of Rick's survival tactics. And yet, in the middle of all that, she still tried. Tried to be present. Tried to be loving. Tried to be Beth. Not just the ghost of Rick in a different body. But it was hard. Because when you've learned to live behind a wall, Opening the door even an inch can feel like letting in a storm. Still, she hadn't given up on herself. Not yet. There were nights when she sat beside Summer on the couch, listening instead of fixing. Moments when she looked Jerry in the eyes and let her voice soften, just a little. Times when Morty spoke and she really heard him, not just as another source of chaos, but as her son, her child, her reason. Those moments didn't erase the mirror between her and Rick, but they reminded her that she wasn't just a reflection. She was a person. Still learning, still reaching, still trying to hold both halves of herself in the same breath, the one shaped by Rick and the one shaped by everything he couldn't be. Sometimes Beth wondered what it would have been like if Rick had stayed. Not the man he became, jaded, unshaven, smelling of engine grease and forgotten guilt, but the version she remembered in fragments. The Rick who used to build toys from scrap metal, who showed her the stars in diagrams and bedtime stories, who kissed her forehead with a promise he didn't keep. What would that father have taught her? Would she still have become a surgeon? Would she have married Jerry? Would she have learned how to cry without apologizing? These questions didn't haunt her like ghosts. They visited like quiet shadows, not to frighten her, but to remind her how little of her life had ever truly been her own. She had grown up with a Rick-shaped absence in her life, and now she lived with a Rick-shaped presence, neither one giving her what she needed, but both shaping her all the same. It was in the little things, the subtle shifts. When she corrected someone at work, she used Rick's tone not cruel, but sharp enough to bruise. When she lost her temper with Jerry, she cut with logic instead of raising her voice the same way Rick dismantled people mid-sentence. And when she was alone, she didn't call anyone. She just sat, quietly, like he did. She told herself it was self-sufficiency, that she was stronger this way. But strength without softness wasn't strength, it was armor. And armor, as she had come to learn, got heavier with time. Beth wasn't heartless, far from it. She just didn't know how to hold her heart and still function at full capacity. So she locked it up and threw herself into structure surgeries, parenting, managing the house, keeping the fabric of her family from tearing completely apart. That was the difference between her and Rick. He burned bridges when they became inconvenient. Beth reinforced them even as they trembled under the weight of everything unspoken. But the similarities kept piling up. One evening, while helping Rick repair a particularly complicated neural interface, she made a joke dark, biting, brilliant. Rick laughed. Not the dismissive chuckle he gave to Morty's chaos or Jerry's confusion, but a real, almost proud laugh. And Beth felt it again. That flicker. That yes, I'm like him. Satisfaction that came with being understood. It didn't matter that the moment passed quickly. That Rick immediately followed it up with an existential musing about consciousness and meat puppets, that he barely remembered it the next day. To Beth it lingered, because for once she hadn't been his burden. She had been his equal. But equal in what? In brilliance or in brokenness? Because Rick's mind was a marvel, but it was also a prison. A fortress built so tall, not even love could climb over the walls. Beth didn't want that. She didn't want to wake up someday older and alone, surrounded by invention, but starved of intimacy. And yet, part of her already was. Even when Jerry reached for her hand. Even when Summer asked for advice. Even when Morty mumbled, "Thanks, Mom," after a rare calm day. She sometimes felt like she was watching it all from the outside. Like Rick must feel always orbiting, never landing. But unlike Rick, Beth still wanted to land. She still wanted the warmth, even if she didn't know how to hold it without flinching. And that's where the tension lived. In the wanting, in the trying, in the space between her potential to become Rick and her stubborn refusal to lose herself completely. So she did what she always did. She walked that line, holding both pieces, pretending not to shake. Because being like Rick didn't mean becoming him. Not unless she stopped choosing. Not unless she gave up the part of her that still cried when no one was looking. The part that still remembered bedtime stories and blueprints drawn on napkins. The part that still whispered, maybe one day he'll say he's sorry. That part, fragile and foolish as it felt, was still Beth's. And as long as it lived inside her, she wasn't lost yet. There was a moment, brief and unassuming, that Beth would remember for a long time. Rick had been working on something in the garage, something dangerous, no doubt, some volatile experiment involving artificial gravity and cloned memory strands. He didn't explain it to her, not at first. He rarely did. But that night, something shifted. He called her over, not with a sarcastic yell or a muttered complaint. Just a quiet, "Hey, Beth, come look at this." She joined him, cautious but curious. And for the first time in a while, he didn't treat her like a student. He spoke to her like a partner. He explained the device, not simplified, not condescending, but with the kind of language reserved for someone who got it. And she did. She followed every word, made 2 adjustments he hadn't thought of. They fixed the sequence together. It was seamless. And for that one small hour, there was no father, no daughter. Just 2 minds, 2 versions of the same fire. Creating, collaborating, connected. When it was done, he handed her the schematic. Didn't say anything. Just gave it to her and went inside. Beth stood there alone in the garage, schematic in hand, feeling the ache of what could have been. It wasn't validation. Not really. It wasn't love either. Rick wasn't built for those things in the traditional sense. But it was acknowledgement, a sliver of it. And that was more than she usually got. She placed the schematic in a drawer, didn't frame it, didn't hide it. Just left it there, where she could find it if she needed reminding that she mattered, at least a little, in his universe. And then came the hard part, going back inside. Back to the family that didn't understand this version of her. Back to Jerry, who asked how her evening was and smiled even when she didn't answer. Back to the dishes in the sink, and the kids half asleep on the couch, and the version of herself she still had to be for them. Sometimes the switch was too fast. Beth would enter the house still humming with Rick's energy, analytical, sharp, buzzing with potential only to be met with soft eyes and everyday questions, and she would snap, or sigh, or withdraw, not because she didn't love them, but because she hadn't yet figured out how to be both people at once. The brilliant one, and the present one. She thought of Rick often in those moments. Not the genius, but the ghost, the man who could never make the transition. The one who lived fully in the cosmos, but never quite touched the earth. And the fear would rise in her like a tide. Was she becoming that too? The kind of person who loved in theory, but not in practice. Who understood the mechanics of feelings, but not their weight. Still, Beth kept trying. She forced herself to sit through long dinners, to listen without interrupting, to hug without thinking about molecules and posture, and how long was too long for physical contact. She told herself that being like Rick didn't mean she had to repeat Rick. Because deep in her, buried under the intellect, under the detachment, under the echoes of her father's voice, was a different kind of strength. One Rick never quite mastered. The strength to stay. To sit with discomfort. To let people in, even when it felt clumsy. To love without turning it into a transaction. She didn't always succeed. There were bad days. Days she felt more like Rick than herself. Days she shut the door to the garage and wished she could stay in there forever. But she always came back. Back to the house. Back to the table. Back to her family. Because while Rick ran from the weight of connection, Beth chose to carry it. Even when it bent her. Even when it hurt. Even when it reminded her of how fragile her balance really was. Beth Smith was Rick's daughter. But she was also her own creation. And with every choice she made to try, to listen, to stay present, she proved that legacy wasn't destiny. It was a mirror. And Beth, quietly, bravely, was learning how to look into it and still see herself. Beth Smith had always known that her marriage wasn't perfect. But in those quieter moments between alien invasions, family meltdowns, and interdimensional chaos, she sometimes found herself wondering, was it ever supposed to be? When she married Jerry, she wasn't thinking about compatibility. She was thinking about stability, about choosing something, or someone who wouldn't leave. Jerry wasn't a genius, and he certainly wasn't extraordinary. But he stayed. He smiled. He loved her, even when she didn't make it easy. And for a long time, that was enough. Or at least, it had to be. Beth had spent her entire life being measured against potential, what she could be, what she could accomplish, what brilliance she could carry if she just focused. But with Jerry, none of that mattered. He didn't challenge her. He didn't push. He didn't even fully understand her. But he was there. And when you're the daughter of a man who vanished into science and stars, that matters. But years passed. Children came. And the slow erosion began. It wasn't dramatic. No huge betrayals. No screaming fights in the rain. Just a quiet unraveling thread by thread, smile by forced smile. Beth would come home after a long day, her mind racing from surgeries and existential puzzles, and Jerry would ask about groceries, or make a pun, or try to cuddle. And it was like oil meeting water, two people floating near each other but never quite blending. And yet, she stayed. Because leaving Jerry would mean admitting that her choice had been a reaction, not a decision. That she hadn't really picked him because she loved him, but because he wasn't Rick. He was the opposite. Safe, predictable, present. But safety has a cost when it dulls who you are. And predictability becomes a cage when your mind was born to wander. So Beth wrestled with herself. She told herself Jerry was enough. That his love was real. That she could mold herself into someone softer, more appreciative, less impatient. But the more she bent, the more brittle she became. Jerry, for all his flaws, tried. He complimented her when she didn't ask. He watched the kids so she could work late. He made her tea even when she forgot to drink it. But Beth, she wanted to feel seen, not just supported. She didn't want praise for managing the chaos. She wanted someone who understood the storm that lived inside her. Someone who didn't just accept her sharp edges, but matched them. And Jerry couldn't do that. He wanted a wife who came home and smiled. Beth wanted a partner who met her in the garage at 2 a.m. with a theory to test. Still, they kept going. Because inertia is a powerful thing. Because divorce was a word neither of them could fully form in their mouths. Because, the kids. Oh, the kids. Beth knew that Summer and Morty were watching. That their marriage, broken, patched, stumbling, was shaping how their children would love in the future. And that knowledge sat like a weight on her chest every time she and Jerry exchanged a tired glance across the kitchen. She wasn't blind to the damage. She just didn't know how to undo it. Because Jerry, for all his awkwardness and insecurity, was trying his best. And sometimes, Beth wasn't even sure she wanted to try anymore. That guilt haunted her more than she liked to admit. Not the guilt of hurting Jerry, but the guilt of wanting more of wanting out when on paper, everything was fine. Fine. The most deceptive word in the human language. Beth's marriage was fine. Their house was fine. Their routines, their conversations, their vacations, all technically fine. But fine doesn't hold you when you cry quietly into your pillow. Fine doesn't make you feel alive. Fine doesn't look into your soul and say, I see you. I love you, all of you. Beth wanted that, even if she didn't know where to find it. There were days when Beth looked at Jerry and tried to remember why she'd fallen for him in the first place. Was it the nervous charm? The unshakable optimism? The way he made her laugh when she didn't want to? Or was it simpler than that, the fact that he was there, steady, orbiting her like a moon around a planet, content just to be near her? Back then, Jerry's simplicity felt like peace. After a childhood spent yearning for a father lost to the stars, Jerry felt grounded, predictable, soft in the way the rest of her life had been sharp. But time has a way of revealing what attraction alone can't sustain. And comfort, when unchallenged, can become complacency. Beth would sometimes catch Jerry watching her, eyes full of a love she couldn't return in full. He'd ask how her day was. She'd say, fine. He'd smile and believe it. And she'd hate herself for how easy it was to lie. Not because she wanted to hurt him, she didn't, but because telling the truth would require a language they didn't speak anymore. They were fluent in logistics now. What time is the parent-teacher conference? Did you pick up milk? Have you seen the remote? But somewhere along the way, they stopped asking each other how their hearts were. Stopped checking in on the parts of themselves that needed more than answers, the parts that needed connection. Beth began to resent Jerry's optimism. The way he always assumed things would work out. The way he believed their marriage would survive, even when it was limping. She envied that innocence. Because Beth knew better. She'd seen what love looked like when it was real and messy and all-consuming. She'd watched Rick love the universe and lose everything because of it. She understood that love wasn't a guarantee, it was a gamble. And their odds didn't feel good. But despite everything, she stayed. Not out of fear, not entirely, but because she still wanted to believe. That maybe, just maybe, the girl who had chosen Jerry still lived somewhere inside her. There were moments, small, flickering moments, like when Jerry held her hand during a terrible movie neither of them enjoyed. Or when he made her laugh without trying, his awkward timing becoming its own kind of charm. Or when she caught him reading parenting articles at 2 a.m., muttering, I think I'm doing this wrong, with tears in his eyes. Beth didn't say anything then. She just watched him from the hallway, arms crossed, heart aching. Because that man, the one who tried, was still worth something. Even if it wasn't everything. Sometimes Beth imagined a different life. One where she'd married someone like Rick, not Rick himself, but someone brilliant, wild, relentless. a partner who challenged her intellect, who saw her hunger and matched it. But then she'd think about the mornings with Jerry, the quiet, sleepy coffee, the way he rubbed his eyes and mumbled good morning like it was a prayer, the way he loved their children without hesitation, without complexity. And she wondered if maybe in some quiet corner of her heart she loved that too. Not enough to fill the space inside her, but enough to keep trying. Beth was not an easy woman to love. She was sharp-edged, deeply conflicted, and often emotionally unavailable. And Jerry, for all his flaws, loved her anyway. That kind of loyalty, it meant something, even if she couldn't always return it in kind. So she stayed. Not because it was perfect. Not because it was what she dreamed of. But because marriage, real marriage, was a decision you made every day. And some days, she still made it. There was one particular night that Beth wouldn't forget. It wasn't during a crisis or after a fight. It was quiet, painfully, almost beautifully so. The kids were asleep. Rick was off-world. And Beth sat at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of untouched tea. It had gone cold long ago, forgotten the thick haze of her thoughts. Jerry walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just shuffled to the counter, opened the fridge, then slowly closed it again, like he'd forgotten why he was there. Then he sat across from her, the weight of routine hanging between them. "Is everything okay?" he asked gently. Beth didn't answer. Not because she didn't have words, but because the words she had were heavy. And Jerry, he wasn't built for heavy. But she looked at him, really looked at him. Tired eyes, hair a little too messy, a shirt with a soft wrinkle from where summer had hugged him earlier. And she realized something. Jerry hadn't changed much. She had. She had grown more distant, more restless, more like Rick. And it wasn't Jerry's fault. He hadn't broken anything. He was still the same man who made her laugh in high school, who panicked when Morty lost a shoe, who proudly told everyone his wife was a surgeon, even when she didn't need him to. And maybe that was the problem. He stayed the same while Beth had begun to fracture, to question everything, to want more and less at the same time. Still, she broke the silence. "Do you ever feel like we're just going through the motions?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Jerry's eyes searched her face. He didn't flinch, didn't joke, didn't offer a silver lining. He just nodded, slowly. "Sometimes," he said. "But I still want to go through them with you." Beth didn't cry. But something inside her cracked. It was so Jerry, the earnestness, the willingness, the absence of pride. And part of her hated how easy it was for him, how love for him wasn't complicated, how he didn't need grand gestures or deep intellectual validation, just time, presence, and affection. Beth used to think that was naive. But in that moment, it felt kind of heroic. She reached across the table, held his hand. And though the gesture didn't fix anything, it meant something. Because it wasn't always about repair. Sometimes it was just about choosing to stay even when the walls felt thin, even when the love felt bruised. They didn't say much more that night. They just sat, fingers loosely laced. Two people, frayed at the edges, still sharing the same table. Beth didn't feel peace. But she felt a small relief, like an exhale she hadn't realized she was holding. Because Jerry, for all his awkwardness, still showed up. And sometimes that's the bravest thing a person can do. The next morning, everything returned to normal. Breakfast, chores, a sarcastic remark from Rick. the world spinning as it always did. But inside Beth, something had shifted. Not drastically. Not enough to rewrite their story, but enough to keep reading. Because when your marriage feels like a question, even a small answer can feel like a lifeline. And Beth, daughter of a genius, mother of two, woman of too many truths, still wasn't done asking. Over time, Beth began to understand that love wasn't always loud. It didn't have to come with fireworks or poetry or even deep understanding. Sometimes it was just the sound of dishes being done without being asked. A hand on her back as she sat in silence. A blanket pulled over her legs when she fell asleep on the couch. Jerry did those things. Not perfectly. Not always. But enough. And maybe that was love, too imperfect, uneven, a little clumsy, but sincere. Still, there were days when Beth slipped. When the distance between them felt like a canyon instead of a crack. When she looked at Jerry and felt like a stranger living with a roommate. When she missed the version of herself that didn't second-guess every choice she'd ever made. She wondered if Jerry had those moments too. If he looked at her and thought, "She's not the girl I married." Because she wasn't. That girl had been softer, more eager to laugh, less aware of how vast and complicated the universe was. Now Beth carried stars behind her eyes. She had touched technology that bent time. She had watched her father rebuild himself in 1,000 different dimensions. And she had learned the hard way that stability was sometimes just inertia dressed in comfort. But still, she didn't leave. Not because she felt trapped, but because even in the mess, there was something worth holding. Beth wasn't sure if she and Jerry were soulmates. She wasn't sure she even believed in soulmates, but she believed in trying. And Jerry's sweet, clumsy, earnest Jerry kept showing up. Even when she was cold. Even when she pulled away. Even when the silence between them stretched a little too long, he stayed. That mattered more than she admitted. Sometimes she imagined leaving. Packing a bag. Finding herself on a distant planet, a new version of Beth, untethered and bold. But then she'd remember the way Morty still asked for her opinion on things he didn't understand. Or the way Summer rolled her eyes and then hugged her with both arms. Or the way Jerry would fix her coffee exactly the way she liked it, even if she forgot to drink it. And she'd stay. Not out of fear. Not because she couldn't leave. But because even in the quiet collapse of what once was, there was something strangely beautiful about rebuilding. Beth began to see love as a kind of architecture. Not the grand buildings that rose out of passion, but these small repairs. The door that squeaks and still gets opened. The floor that creaks but is swept anyway. The light bulb replaced, not because it's urgent, but because it matters. Their marriage was not a mansion. It was a modest, lived-in home. With cracks and mismatched paint. But warmth, too, and history. Beth wasn't sure what the future held. If they'd make it another year, or 5, or 50. But tonight they shared a bed. She turned off the light, felt Jerry shift slightly beside her. He didn't reach for her, and she didn't reach for him. But their breathing synced. Their backs faced one another, but not out of anger. Just habit. Comfort. And in that breath, between wakefulness and sleep, Beth realized this was still a kind of love. Maybe not the kind you dream of, but the kind you build. One quiet night at a time. There was a moment in Beth Smith's life when she stopped being just one person. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, literally. The choice had been made by Rick, by circumstance, maybe even by Beth herself, and from that moment on, there were two of her. Two Beths, one who stayed home, one who went to space, and neither knew which was which. That was the point, wasn't it? Rick had refused to say. He called it Schrodinger's daughter, the ultimate non-answer. He had taken her uncertainty and made it canon, not just a joke, not just a test, but a permanent question she'd carry in her bones. Was she the Beth who chose her family? Or the Beth who needed to escape? Was she the clone, built to stay behind and fill the role of mother and wife? Or the original, the one brave enough or selfish enough to chase the stars? Beth didn't know. And the not knowing haunted her more than any truth ever could. Because deep down, she had always wondered what kind of person she was. Was she loyal or afraid? Was she restless or lost? Now she could look herself in the eye literally and still not find the answer. Because the other Beth was her in every way. Same voice, same mind, same memories, but different choices. And those choices mattered. Space Beth, bold, armored, battle-worn, was everything the earthbound Beth sometimes wished she could be. Unburdened by routine, untouched by compromise, unapologetically herself. She wielded technology and wit like weapons. She commanded ships and broke rules. She wasn't a daughter or a wife or a mother, at least, not primarily. She was an individual, a force, a Beth that never stayed still. And yet, when the two of them stood in the same room, Beth and Beth, it wasn't resentment that filled the air. It was recognition. Because they weren't rivals. They were reflections. Each carried half the truth. The Beth who stayed envied the freedom. The Beth who left missed the love. And between them floated the unspoken truth. No matter which one was the original, neither was whole without the other. Their first reunion hadn't been dramatic. No screaming. No sci-fi showdown. Just a strange quiet. Two versions of the same woman, measuring each other, not with suspicion, but with sorrow. "You look tired," Space Beth had said with a smirk. "So do you," said Home Beth, just in a different way. And they both laughed. The same exact laugh. Sharp and dry and a little sad. There was no clear way to integrate their lives. No manual for emotional duplication. But there was understanding. Instant and instinctive. Each knew what the other had gained. Each knew what the other had lost. Home Beth had stayed for her family. She'd changed diapers, mended broken fences, kept the house from falling apart. Space Beth had chased rebellion. She'd flown into asteroid storms, faced alien tyrants, lived like a legend. But neither path was perfect. And neither woman was at peace. They circled each other like twin stars, not colliding, not fleeing, just orbiting. And slowly, something surprising happened. They began to share. Not just stories, but selves. Space Beth would take the kids to the arcade while Home Beth took a nap. Home Beth would swap gadgets with her double, experimenting with tech she never dared touch before. There was jealousy sometimes, tension, snide remarks and veiled comparisons. But there was also healing, because for the first time, Beth could talk to someone who understood. Not guessed, not sympathized, but knew. The voice inside her head now had a face. The mirror no longer just reflected, it replied. And though it was jarring at first, Beth realized maybe she had needed this all along. Not a clone, not an answer, but a conversation with the parts of herself she had buried to survive. It didn't take long for the family to adjust. At least, not outwardly. Rick acted as if it was all perfectly normal. Like having two versions of his daughter in the same room was just another Wednesday. Maybe for him it was. Morty, bless his heart, tried to treat them equally. He offered each Beth a hug. He said "Mom" to both and let context sort it out. Summer rolled her eyes and muttered, "Great, now there's two of you." But even she couldn't hide the flicker of fascination. Jerry didn't handle it as well. He stared a little too long at Space Beth, laughed a little too hard at her jokes, and Home Beth noticed. Of course she did. She watched as Jerry struggled to navigate this new version of his wife, the confident, assertive one. The one who wasn't worn down by routine or self-doubt. The one who didn't need his reassurance because she had built her own. It stung. Not because Beth felt replaced, but because she saw, for the first time, how she might have seemed to Jerry before the years layered on like dust. She wondered if this was the Beth he had always wanted her to be. And if so, what did that make her? But instead of lashing out, she let it pass. Because it wasn't Space Beth's fault. And it wasn't Jerry's either. It was hers, in the quiet, aching way that regrets settle deep in the bones. Beth had made choices. So had they all. Now she had to live with them in stereo. One afternoon, the two Beths sat in the backyard. It was quiet. A breeze stirred the air, rustling the leaves like a soft whisper. They didn't speak for a while. Just sat. The silence, not heavy, just full. Then Space Beth said, "You ever think about who we used to be?" Home Beth didn't answer right away. She was watching a squirrel on the fence. It seemed so unaware of everything, of parallel lives, of stolen choices. "I think about who we might still become," she finally replied. Space Beth smiled. A small, proud curl of the lip. "You still think like a doctor." Beth shook her head. "No, I think like a mother." And with that they found a kind of peace. They weren't the same anymore. And maybe they never had been. Not because of the clone question, but because life had shaped them differently. Experience, not biology, had drawn the line. But they still shared a soul. Maybe fractured, maybe confused, but undeniably shared. There was a night when the two Beths got drunk together, just the two of them, locked in Rick's garage away from the noise of the house. They talked about Rick, the father who gave them everything and nothing. They talked about the kids who didn't seem as thrown off as they'd expected. And they talked about themselves. The things they missed. The things they feared. The things they envied in each other. Space. Beth admitted she sometimes dreamed of staying. Of pancakes in the morning and movie nights and birthday cakes with slightly too much frosting. Home Beth admitted she dreamed of leaving, of chasing comets, of dueling aliens on forgotten moons, of being something more than a name on a family calendar. They clinked glasses. To possibilities. To pain. To being enough. And for a fleeting second, they weren't two people anymore. Just one woman, trying to understand herself from the outside in. It wasn't perfect after that. Sometimes they fought. Sometimes they pulled away. Sometimes Home Beth would catch Space Beth staring at her kids with a longing that made her chest ache. But they never tried to erase each other, because they both knew. Without the other, they wouldn't have survived. One carried the burden. The other carried the freedom. And together, they held the full weight of what it meant to be Beth Smith. Over time, the two Beths began to develop something unspoken between them, a rhythm, Not just coexistence, not just a schedule, but a kind of emotional choreography. They learned when to give each other space, when to switch places for the day, when to let the other be the parent or the daughter or the survivor. Home Beth would wake early some mornings and find Space Beth already in the kitchen, making Morty's favorite eggs. No one questioned it anymore. Not the kids, not Jerry, not even Rick. Because somehow, both versions of Beth fit. Their presence together no longer felt jarring. It felt full. It was strange, though. Even as things settled on the surface, deep inside Beth, there was a quiet tension. She began to wonder, if you could split yourself in two and both versions found their place, which one was the real you? Or were you only truly whole when you stopped trying to separate? Some nights, she would lie in bed and stare at the ceiling. She'd listen to the house, the soft hum of machines, the distant footsteps of someone up too late. She didn't always know which Beth was sleeping in that room anymore. Sometimes it was her. Sometimes maybe not. But what she realized over time was it didn't matter. She and Space Beth had stopped needing to label themselves. There was no longer a real Beth and a copy. There was just Beth, living two lives, carrying two paths, choosing both every day. There was a moment soft and easy to miss that marked a turning point. Beth was tucking Summer in after a particularly hard day. Summer had been quiet all evening. She wasn't asking for help, she wasn't angry. Just tired. Beth sat on the edge of the bed, brushing a strand of hair behind Summer's ear, the way she used to when Summer was small. And Summer asked, "Do you ever wish you were someone else?" Beth didn't answer right away. She thought of her other self, the one who flew through galaxies, faced danger with a smirk, held laser guns like toys. And then she looked at her daughter, this brave, sharp, wonderfully complicated girl, and said, "Sometimes. But I always come back to who I am." Summer didn't nod or smile. She just pulled the blanket up to her chin and whispered, "Yeah, me too." Beth kissed her forehead, stood up, turned off the light. And as she walked out, she passed Space Beth in the hallway, just quietly leaning against the wall, arms crossed, listening. Their eyes met. Nothing was said. But something passed between them. A softness. A quiet agreement. They weren't trying to replace each other anymore. They were trying to understand each other. To protect the things they both loved. To make peace with the parts of themselves they once tried to outrun. The more Beth lived alongside herself, the more she began to feel integrated. She stopped asking the big questions with such desperation. Stopped chasing certainty. Instead, she learned to live in the paradox. She could be strong and scared, smart and uncertain, nurturing and selfish, staying and leaving. She was both Beth's, not by biology, but by spirit. And that duality wasn't her weakness. It was her strength. Because who better to understand you than you? There came a day when both Beths stood together at the edge of the driveway, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It had been an ordinary day. Laundry, groceries, a rogue alien tried to steal Rick's ship. Summer failed a test. Jerry made dinner. And yet somehow it felt like a milestone. Home Beth was sipping from a cup of lukewarm tea. Space Beth had her boots untied, helmet in hand, a quiet exhaustion resting behind her eyes. They weren't talking. They didn't need to. Behind them the house glowed faintly. Inside were their children, their messes, their memories. The chaos and the comfort all wrapped together. And as they stood there in the dimming light, Beth realized something had shifted. she no longer felt incomplete. Not because she had an answer. Not because Rick had finally confessed which Beth was the original. But because she had stopped needing to know. Her identity wasn't a puzzle to be solved. It was a story ongoing, evolving, sometimes contradictory, always real. And that story now had layers she never expected. A mirror that no longer haunted her. A sister who was also herself. In quiet moments, Beth sometimes wrote in a notebook. Just small lines. Thoughts. Fragments of who she was trying to be. One entry read, "Sometimes I feel like the ghost of myself. Other times I feel like the flame." Another, "I used to think I had to choose. Now I see I am both." She never showed anyone the pages. Not Rick. Not Jerry. Not even her other self. But she didn't write for them. She wrote to anchor something inside herself, to tether her identity in a world where versions were infinite and selves could multiply without permission. And it helped. A quiet ritual in a noisy universe. There was one day, not long after another dangerous adventure, when Rick finally spoke. He walked into the garage where both Beths were working on a gadget together, hands stained with oil, sleeves rolled up, focused and content. Rick paused in the doorway. "You know," he muttered, "I don't actually remember which one of you I cloned." The Beths didn't look up. Home Beth said, "We figured." Space Beth added, "Doesn't matter anymore." Rick hesitated. Then, with the faintest flicker of emotion in his voice, said, "Glad you're both here." And then he left. Like always. But the words hung in the air. And they mattered more than either Beth would ever admit. Life continued. Some days, they switched roles just to keep things balanced. Space Beth would take Jerry on a date. Home Beth would fly the kids to a cosmic amusement park. They shared holidays, shared stories, shared the deep, strange knowledge of being split and yet still whole. And somewhere along the way, they stopped thinking of themselves as halves. They stopped measuring which life was better or more valid or more free. They had become a constellation, two lights orbiting each other. Each bright, each flawed, each part of something greater. Beth's journey wasn't about choosing who to be. It was about accepting who she already was. A daughter shaped by a flawed genius, a mother fumbling toward love, a partner still learning how to hold and be held, a scientist, a dreamer, a fighter, and a woman who was no longer afraid to look herself in the eye, because she was herself, every version, every path, every scar, and every strength, two Beths, one soul, always. Motherhood didn't come easily to Beth Smith, not because she didn't care, not because she didn't try, but because caring too much was her curse. Even when she was young, Beth had wanted to be a mother, or maybe more truthfully, she wanted to be better than the parent she had. She saw her father, brilliant and broken, a man who drifted through life like a storm in a bottle, and she told herself she'd never do the same. She wouldn't leave. She wouldn't forget. She wouldn't make her children feel like the background noise to a genius's monologue. And yet, years later, there she was, tired, sharp-tongued, stretched thin, trying to raise two children, while the ghosts of her own upbringing whispered behind her eyes. Morty was easy to love in his way. Sweet, anxious, always hoping for approval. He reminded Beth of herself as a child, constantly looking up, reaching for someone who was too busy, too scattered, too somewhere else. Summer was different. Defiant. Confident on the outside, uncertain beneath. Beth often saw a mirror in her daughter, but not the kind she liked. It wasn't always easy to hug Summer, to reassure her, to soften. Sometimes Beth said the right thing. Sometimes she didn't. Sometimes she walked away before the conversation was over. And afterward, she'd sit in the garage or by the kitchen sink, fingers curled around a mug of something lukewarm, wondering why being a mother didn't feel more like it looked in her head. She wanted to give them the world. But too often, she gave them a woman distracted, half-heard, lost in her own quiet storms. There were days Beth would find herself scrolling through old photos Summer as a baby, Morty in Halloween costumes, blurry birthday parties with store-bought cake and lopsided candles. She'd feel warmth. She'd feel regret. She'd feel both, tangled up like ivy around her ribs. I was there, she'd think. I showed up. But then she'd hear Summer mention how Rick always made things interesting. Or Morty talk about some interdimensional adventure that changed how he saw everything. And suddenly, Beth would wonder if presence had ever been enough. Did her children love her? Yes, deeply. But did they see her? Or did they just see Mom, the one who cleaned up, who sighed through dinners, who existed around the edges while Rick lit up the center of the room? She tried. God, she tried. But sometimes trying isn't a straight line. It's a spiral full of days that felt too short, of words left unsaid, of hugs that came too late. One afternoon, Summer slammed her door. They'd argued again about rules, about school, about how Beth just didn't get it. Beth stood in the hallway, her breath catching in her throat, 1,000 responses forming and fading on her lips. And instead of yelling, she sat on the floor. Back against the wall, arms resting on her knees, she just sat listening to her daughter's silence. That silence hurt more than any scream, because Beth knew what it meant to feel misunderstood, to want space and not know how to ask for it, to push away the very people whose love you craved. Later that night, she left a cup of tea outside Summer's door. No note, no apology, just a gesture. The next morning, it was gone. Beth wasn't always gentle, but she was present. Even when her heart was fraying, even when Rick's chaos was tearing holes in their reality, even when Jerry's insecurities added weight to her shoulders, she stayed. She woke up. She packed lunches. She stitched wounds. She listened when she could. She forgave when it counted. And in quiet moments, when the house was still and everyone else was asleep, she'd wonder, what kind of mother am I really? Not the kind with the perfectly planned birthdays. Not the kind who journaled every milestone. Not the kind who always said the right thing. But maybe the kind who tried, even when she felt like she was failing. And in a world of collapsing dimensions and infinite versions of herself, maybe that was enough. Rick had never been a model for parenting, and Beth never expected him to be. He was brilliant, yes, a force of nature. But warmth wasn't his language. Support didn't come in hugs or bedtime stories. It came in inventions, distractions, and manic logic. Still, a part of Beth always craved his approval. Even long after she'd become a parent herself. She wanted him to say he was proud. To tell her she was doing okay. That her kids were turning out just fine, not in spite of her, but because of her. But Rick didn't offer things like that. And so Beth chased certainty in other ways. She scheduled family dinners. She checked school assignments. She signed permission slips and pretended not to flinch when Rick offered to upgrade Morty's brain. Sometimes she stood at the window with a dish towel in her hand, watching Rick and Morty vanish into a portal. Her eyes lingered on the empty space they left behind, glowing, humming, quiet. She didn't say it aloud, but the thought pressed against her ribs. I should have gone with them. Not because she wanted the adventure, but because she wanted to understand them, the two most complicated pieces of her life. Instead, she stayed behind. Again, folding laundry, reheating leftovers, listening for the sound of Rick's ship returning from who knows where, always hoping that her son would step out in one piece. Beth sometimes wondered how much of herself she passed down to her kids. Summer had her sarcasm, her fire. Morty had her empathy, her need to be needed. And they both had a little of Rick. Whether they liked it or not, his sharp tongue, his unquenchable curiosity, his tendency to self-destruct just before admitting they were scared. Beth had tried to raise them right. Tried to teach them about consequences, about honesty, about boundaries. But how do you talk about rules in a house where physics bends to willpower and nothing stays stable for long? One night, Summer came home angry. She'd been out with Rick another mission, another memory, another weight added to her young shoulders. Beth tried to ask what happened. Summer snapped. Why do you even care? You didn't stop him. Beth froze. She could have yelled. Could have reminded her daughter that she did care, that she always had. But she didn't. She just stepped forward, wrapped Summer in her arms, and said softly, I know I didn't stop him. I'm sorry. I wish I could protect you from everything. Summer didn't pull away. And for a few minutes they just stood there, surrounded by the quiet hum of the house. Mother and daughter sharing one of those rare, unspoken understandings. Beth wasn't perfect. She lost her temper. She got distracted. She let Rick get away with too much. But she also stayed up late checking on Morty when he had night terrors. She kept Summer's old trophies, even the ones from contests that didn't matter. She made pancakes on snow days, even when the world was falling apart. She tried to give her kids something constant. Not perfection, just consistency. Because in a universe where planets exploded and timelines collapsed, Beth hoped her children could always count on her, even if she wasn't always sure who that her really was. She'd never win Mother of the Year, not in any dimension. But Beth didn't care about trophies or titles. She cared about moments. The way Morty smiled when she remembered his favorite cereal. The way Summer rolled her eyes but still came to her when something hurt. Oh, the way her kids sometimes looked at her like she might have the answers even when she didn't. And those moments, they were everything. Tiny constellations in the long, dark sky of parenthood. There were days Beth felt like a ghost in her own home. She moved through rooms like she was floating, doing all the right things, saying the expected word but never quite feeling present. It wasn't anyone's fault. Not Jerry's, not the kids, not even Rick's. It was just the wear and tear of holding everything together. Of keeping the lights on, the family functional, the chaos manageable, while never truly letting anyone see the weight she carried. Beth didn't cry in front of people. She didn't collapse, didn't retreat into dramatic outbursts or long silences. Instead, she kept going. Even when she doubted herself. Even when she worried she was messing everything up, She wore strength like a second skin, stitched together from all the things she couldn't say. And most nights, once everyone else had gone to bed, she'd sit quietly at the table, fingers wrapped around a cooling mug of tea, staring at nothing in particular. just breathing. Sometimes that was all she could manage, and sometimes that was enough. Beth had never really asked for help. It wasn't how she was raised. As a child, emotions had felt like vulnerabilities, things to be managed, hidden, reasoned away. So when Summer came to her once, eyes red from crying, saying nothing but sitting beside her, Beth didn't ask questions. She didn't press, didn't offer solutions. She just took her daughter's hand, held it gently, and let the silence speak for them both. That night, Beth realized something. Being a mother wasn't always about answers. Sometimes it was just about being there quietly, consistently, with love that didn't need to be explained. Still, the guilt never truly left her. Guilt for the adventures she said no to. Guilt for the ones she said yes to. Guilt for choosing Rick over Jerry sometimes, or Jerry over Rick, and always wondering what the kids were picking up from that imbalance. She worried about Morty's sense of self. She worried about Summer's cynicism. She worried about how often they had to parent themselves while she tried to make sense of the world and herself all at once. Beth knew she wasn't easy to read. She could be sharp, dismissive, overly rational. She wanted to be warm, but sometimes she mistook warmth for weakness. She wanted to be nurturing, but often felt like she was just holding everything at arm's length to survive another day. And in those moments, the mirror became cruel. Not because it reflected her flaws, but because it reflected her effort. All the things she did behind the scenes. All the quiet ways she tried. And somehow it still didn't feel like enough. But there were moments, rare, precious ones, that gave her pause. A note from Morty, left on the fridge, reading, "Thanks for making my costume. You're the best." A scribble in Summer's old notebook. Mom's not perfect, but she always comes through. A quiet afternoon where the kids were watching TV and Beth dozed off beside them on the couch, not because she meant to, but because she finally felt safe enough to let go. In those moments, something settled inside her. Maybe motherhood didn't have to look like the stories she once told herself. Maybe it was messy, clumsy, full of mistakes, but also full of love. Real love. Not the dramatic kind, not the fairy tale version, but the kind that showed up over and over, even when no one was watching. There came a quiet Saturday morning when the house felt unusually still, the kind of stillness that only came when no one needed anything. No portal alarms. No late-night yelling. No existential emergencies. Beth sat at the kitchen table, the sun barely peeking in through the blinds, casting golden streaks across the cluttered countertop. Morty was asleep. Summer was out early for a school project. Jerry had taken the car to get fixed. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Beth had the space to breathe. She stared at her coffee. It had gone cold. She didn't mind. In that moment, she allowed herself to sit in the silence, not as a mother, not as a wife, not as Rick's daughter, but just as Beth. She didn't often give herself permission to do that. It was always about being what someone else needed. Supportive, strong, decisive, capable. But here, in the quiet hum of a sunlit kitchen, Beth felt something rare. Peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because she no longer needed it to be. She thought about all the years she'd tried to measure motherhood like a checklist. All the late-night doubts. All the comparisons. All the moments where she wondered if she'd done enough. But something had changed. It wasn't that the questions had disappeared. They never would. It was that Beth had stopped expecting motherhood to make sense. She had stopped waiting for a sign that she was doing it right. Because the truth was, her kids were growing. They laughed. They argued. They made mistakes and came home and kept being themselves, not in spite of her, but alongside her. And that meant something. Later that day, Morty walked into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. Hey, Mom. Thanks for not letting Rick take me into that brain parasite war thing last week. Beth smiled, gently tousling his hair. You're welcome, honey. He poured cereal, sat beside her. Didn't say anything else. Didn't have to. A little while later, Summer returned, dropped her backpack by the door, sighed dramatically, and mumbled something about group projects being the worst. Beth looked up. You want help? Summer raised an eyebrow. Nah, I mean maybe. Just, can you sit with me while I work? Beth nodded. Of course. It was in these small things, the unspoken requests, the quiet gratitude, the way her children still chose her presence, even when they didn't need her for anything grand, that Beth found her answer. She wasn't perfect. She never would be. But her kids still came home, still leaned on her, still saw her, and that mattered. Later that night, she stood in the doorway of their rooms, watched them sleep. Morty curled up under a tangle of blankets, one foot hanging off the edge. Summer, headphones still in, faint music leaking through. Both peaceful in their own messy, imperfect ways. Beth smiled softly. She didn't know what kind of mother she'd be in other dimensions. In timelines where she'd left or stayed or turned into someone unrecognizable. But in this one, this quiet, unpredictable, flawed little life she had tried. Tried with all her heart. Tried when she was tired. Tried when she didn't know how. And maybe that was enough. Beth Smith had spent most of her life orbiting other people. Rick, the comet of chaos. Jerry, the echo of safe choices. Summer and Morty, the stars she tried to hold in balance. And somewhere between the portals and pot roasts, surgeries and school nights, Beth had forgotten what it meant to be herself. Not a daughter, not a wife, not a mother, just Beth. It was a strange thought. Uncomfortable at first. Like trying on shoes that didn't belong to her. But it lingered. And over time, it became something she couldn't ignore. The first time she really felt it was during a quiet moment in the garage. Rick had been gone for a few days off, chasing whatever wild theory or ancient enemy had drawn his attention this time. The garage was still. Dust particles floated in a shaft of light from the ceiling bulb. A few of Rick's half-finished inventions blinked quietly like sleeping animals. Beth sat on a stool beside the workbench. No reason, no emergency, just because. And in that stillness, she realized something. She didn't miss him. Not in the way she used to, not with the ache of abandonment or the burn of unresolved childhood wounds. She missed what she thought he could be, but not who he was. And for the first time, that thought didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like truth. Beth had spent so long trying to earn Rick's attention, to prove she was smart enough, brave enough, capable enough. But it had always been a moving target. Every success felt invisible, every mistake magnified. She remembered being a child, showing him drawings, science projects, riding her bike without training wheels. He'd smile sometimes, nod distracted. Other times he'd say, "That's cute, but do you want to see something real?" And then he'd vanish into a glowing door, taking the spotlight with him. Beth had told herself that wasn't abandonment. It was brilliance. Genius was hard to anchor. But now, as an adult, she knew better. Genius wasn't the problem. Absence was. There was a version of her out there, somewhere, who'd left this family behind. The Space Beth. The warrior, the wanderer, the unburdened half. At first, Beth had resented her. How dare she take the easy road? How dare she leave her children, her marriage, her responsibilities? But deep down, Beth envied her too. The freedom, the clarity, the absence of guilt. She envied a version of herself that didn't wake up with a to-do list burned into her brain. But then came the truth, sharp and quiet. She had chosen to stay. That meant something. Not because it was the right choice for everyone, but because it was right for her. She had made that decision not out of fear, but out of hope. Hope that she could be more than the sum of her roles. Hope that staying didn't mean giving up, it just meant choosing to be present. And now, after all these years, Beth was beginning to ask a new question. What do I want? Not what do the kids need? Not what does Jerry expect? Not what would Rick do? What does Beth want? It was a question that had no immediate answer. And that was okay. She didn't need a thesis. She didn't need a 5-year plan. She just needed a starting point. So she began with small things. Reading novels again. Saying no when she meant no. Taking solo walks through the backyard in the early evening, just to feel the breeze. These were her choices. Quiet. Intentional. Hers. There was a day, an ordinary one, when Beth stood in front of the bathroom mirror and didn't rush. No chaos. No Rick yelling from the garage. No Jerry asking where his tie was. No kids yelling about cereal, or portal fluid, or the apocalypse. Just Beth. She stared at her own reflection. Not with judgment. Not looking for flaws. Just looking. And for once, she didn't see a checklist of failures or compromises. She saw someone trying. Someone tired, yes. Someone a little frayed at the edges. But also someone standing, still here, still choosing. And in that stillness, she gave herself something she hadn't in years. Permission. To be tired. To not have all the answers. To need more than what she was allowing herself. Later that day, Beth sat in her bedroom with the door closed, not out of stress, but intention. She'd found an old sketchbook in the garage. One she used to draw in before med school. Before kids. Before everything got so loud. Inside were half-finished sketches. Horses, stars, faces she couldn't remember now. The pencil lines were soft, uncertain. She picked it up again. Her hand hesitated. Was this silly? A waste of time? Should she be folding laundry instead? But then she remembered. There would always be laundry. There would not always be this moment. And so she drew quietly, softly. Not for anyone else. Not to impress. Just because the lines made her feel calm. It wasn't about the drawing. It was about the return to herself. Beth started finding these quiet rebellions everywhere. She didn't tell anyone. Didn't announce that she was on a journey. Didn't post inspirational quotes on the fridge. She just shifted. When Rick offered another grand adventure, she paused before answering. Sometimes she said yes. Sometimes she didn't. And when Jerry defaulted into his usual neediness, she gently reminded him that she wasn't responsible for his self-worth. That was new, and it felt scary, but it also felt honest. Summer noticed first. "You've been different," she said one evening. eating cold noodles at the counter. Like calmer. Are you okay? Beth smiled. I'm figuring that out. Summer blinked. That's kind of awesome, actually. They clinked chopsticks. Morty noticed too, in his own way. Grandpa Rick said you're going soft, he told her after school one day. Beth raised an eyebrow. And what do you think? Morty shrugged. I think you're just more real, like you're not trying so hard all the time. Beth didn't say anything for a while. Then she leaned down, kissed the top of his head, and whispered, Thanks, Morty. Because sometimes insight came from the most unexpected places. But of course, Rick noticed too. And he didn't love it. He started pushing harder, offering bigger inventions, riskier trips, more pointed jabs about how she was domesticating herself into irrelevance. Beth didn't flinch. She just looked at him, really looked, and said, I don't need to prove myself to you anymore. That hit him harder than any insult could. Rick scoffed, called it sentimental nonsense, and disappeared through a portal. But that night, he came back, quietly. No fanfare. And he left a small gadget on the table, something to help her sleep. No explanation, no apology. Just a silent gesture. And for Rick, that was almost a confession. Beth didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. These small shifts, these quiet acts of self-recognition were adding up. They weren't revolutionary. They weren't dramatic. But they were hers. For so long, she had lived in reaction to the chaos around her. Now, she was responding to herself, her wants, her voice, her peace. And with every passing day, that voice was becoming clearer. It's strange how things start to feel different even when they look the same. Beth still woke up early most mornings. Still got the kids out the door. Still stitched cuts and burns in the ER. Still passed Rick in the hallway. Still picked up Jerry's socks. But now her days were laced with a quiet awareness. A choice. She wasn't on autopilot anymore. She was present. Selective. And perhaps most importantly, kinder to herself. She no longer equated exhaustion with failure. No longer punished herself for needing rest or space or softness. She realized that being strong didn't mean being invincible. It meant being human, being whole. One evening, she found herself sitting with Jerry on the couch. An old sci-fi rerun hummed softly on the screen. Morty was off with Rick somewhere. Summer was out with friends. The house was peaceful for once. Jerry looked over and asked, Are we okay? It was the kind of question he asked when he was nervous, when he felt the shift but didn't understand it. Beth smiled, leaning her head back on the cushion. We're growing. Jerry blinked. Is that a yes? Beth laughed softly. It means we're not stuck at something. He nodded, unsure, but accepted it. For Jerry, growth was hard. He liked routine, predictability. But even he had begun to sense that Beth wasn't folding herself into old shapes anymore. She was unfolding, reclaiming space. And strangely, it didn't drive them apart. It gave their relationship room to breathe. Jerry began stepping up more, not because he was asked, but because he saw her. He saw the woman beside him wasn't shrinking. She was standing taller than ever, and he wanted to meet her there. With the kids, things changed too, not through lectures or lessons, but through presence. Beth became someone they could come to not just as a parent with rules, but as a person with experience. Summer asked deeper questions, not just about science or school, but about choices. Did you ever feel like you lost yourself? She asked one night, curled up in Beth's bed, eyes wide with quiet worry. Beth ran her fingers through Summer's hair. "All the time," she said. "But every time, I found a little more of myself on the way back." Summer nodded. That meant something. She didn't need perfection from her mother. She just needed honesty. And Beth had finally found the courage to offer it. Morty, too, became more open. They took walks together, nothing grand, just neighborhood loops. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. One evening, Morty pointed at the stars overhead and said, "Do you ever wish you were out there instead?" Beth paused, thought carefully. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I remember, everything out there still feels empty when you're not right with yourself." Morty looked at her with the kind of respect that didn't need to be said out loud. He understood now that his mom wasn't just holding it together. She was learning how to live. Rick never fully understood the change. He noticed it, yes, acknowledged it in his own strange ways. But he never quite grasped how Beth had stepped out of his shadow, not by defying him, but by no longer needing his approval. That baffled him. Because for Rick, everything was a reaction. To the universe, to pain, to the things he couldn't control. Beth, meanwhile, had stopped reacting. She'd started creating something different, on a space for herself. She still loved her father, still admired parts of him, still mourned what they could never fully repair. But she was no longer waiting for praise, waiting for apology, waiting for a version of Rick who might never come. She had her boundaries now. Not walls, just edges. Lines that said, "This is who I am, and I won't disappear inside anyone else anymore." There was a moment, months into this quiet shift, when Beth stood in the garage with Rick again. He held up a strange-looking device. "It lets you see the multiversal versions of yourself who made different choices," he said, like a salesman with a smug grin. Beth tilted her head. "Why would I want that?" Rick shrugged. "Curiosity, self-validation, masochism." Beth smiled soft, not unkind. "I don't need to see who I could have been," she said. "I finally like who I am." Rick blinked. For the first time in a long time, he had nothing to say. There was no grand moment, no cosmic revelation or glowing epiphany. Just a morning quiet and unremarkable, where Beth poured herself a cup of coffee and realized she felt okay. Not amazing, not euphoric, just settled. For someone who had spent so much of her life running, performing, fixing the stillness was everything. She stood by the kitchen window, watching the backyard sway in a soft wind. The trees rustled like they were whispering secrets. The sky was its usual pale blue. Morty's backpack was slumped near the door. Summer's sneakers kicked off in the hallway. Jerry was snoring faintly upstairs. And Beth? Beth was here. No portals. No panic. Just presence. Later that day, she visited the stables, the small veterinary clinic in the outskirts of town where she occasionally volunteered. There was a horse there named Cassiopeia Skittish. Quiet, never quite comfortable being touched. Beth had been working with her for weeks. Gentle approaches, soothing tones, letting silence do the work. That afternoon, something changed. As Beth stood near the gate, Cassiopeia walked up slow, cautious, and pressed her nose gently against Beth's hand. It lasted only a few seconds. But Beth felt it deeply. Connection. Trust. Choice. That was the kind of moment she lived for now. Not the applause. Not the approval. Just the quiet grace of being chosen by herself, by others in a world that never stopped moving. That night, she sat alone in Rick's garage. He wasn't there. Off-world again. She didn't miss the chaos. Instead, she looked around at the remnants of his brilliance, half-built gadgets, blinking lights, endless notes and handwriting only he could fully understand. Beth didn't feel dwarfed by it anymore. She didn't feel like a shadow cast by his genius. She felt like herself. Brilliant in her own right, capable, complicated, and finally complete. She didn't need to outshine him. She didn't need to run from him. She had learned how to coexist not just with Rick, but with her own expectations, wounds, and worth. There were still bad days. Times she doubted herself. Times the voices came back, the ones that whispered, "You're not enough." But now, she didn't believe them so quickly. Now she had proof, not from the universe. Not from the universe. Not from the universe. Not from Rick or Jerry or the kids. From herself. In the mirror. In the sketches tucked in her drawer. In the warmth of her voice when she answered the phone. She had become someone she respected. Someone she trusted. Someone she could come home to. And that changed everything. One evening, Summer sat beside her in the living room, the TV playing something neither of them was really watching. "Hey, Mom," Summer said quietly. "Do you think I'll ever figure it out?" Beth looked over. "Figure what out?" "Who I am. Who I want to be." Beth smiled gently. "I think you already are. The rest is just remembering." Summer leaned her head on her mom's shoulder. And in that moment, Beth realized this was the cycle healing itself. Not through perfection, not through certainty, but through presence, through love, through choosing to stay and choosing yourself within the staying. Later that night, Beth stood at the edge of the backyard, looking up at the sky. No portal cracks. No incoming ships, just stars. And she smiled, small, quiet, real. Because for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't waiting. Not for a version of herself. Not for a better timeline. Not for Rick to say what he never could. She had chosen herself. Fully, calmly, completely. And with that choice, she had finally come home. Thank you for joining us tonight. If Beth Smith's story brought you even a little closer to peace, to stillness, to yourself, then we're grateful. Here on Sleepy Lore, it's never really about the chaos or the comedy. It's about the quiet truths hiding underneath, the soft questions, the echoes we carry. Beth's journey wasn't easy. It wasn't linear, but it was hers. And maybe that's the kind of story we all need sometimes. Good night, sleepyheads. Until next time, rest well and keep choosing yourself.